Why did the dog block the barn door? The truth broke the town. At first, folks in town thought the old dog had gone aggressive. He'd growl if anyone got near the barn. He wouldn't leave, wouldn't eat, wouldn't let anyone inside. Until the sheriff finally looked and found the girl. She was bruised, hungry, silent. But the note clenched in her tiny hand told the truth. "Please don't send me back to Mommy. She hurts me." And that German shepherd? He'd stood guard over her for 4 days and nights, chasing off every shadow like it owed him something. What followed was a trial that shattered the peace of a quiet town. A father who returned from war to find the daughter he never knew he'd almost lost, and a dog whose instincts rewrote the fate of a broken family. The dog didn't bark, but he told the truth louder than anyone else ever could. The wind had a way of speaking in Vermont winters, a hollow, rasping whisper that crept through the bare fields and slipped beneath old doors. On that night, the air carried a brittle sharpness, as if the world itself had frozen mid-breath, waiting for something unseen to stir. Snow had not yet fallen, but the clouds gathered heavy above the hills, bruised violet and gray, ready to release their burden. Inside a weather-worn farmhouse, the only light came from a lamp resting on a scarred oak table. Samuel Hayes sat hunched beside it, his hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. At 58, he carried his years the way an old soldier carries scars, quietly, without ceremony. His face bore the weathered marks of both storm and service. Creases etched deep around his eyes, a jaw gone silver with stubble, a body still solid but stiff with aches that spoke of more than just age. He had once been a police officer, one of the best handlers in the K-9 unit. But those days had slipped into memory. His companion now was silence. Silence and the low hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of a clock that seemed louder at night, and the steady presence of the old dog lying at the hearth. Ranger, his German shepherd, was 11 now. His coat, once thick and dark, had paled along the muzzle and finned around his haunches, but his eyes, amber unyielding, still burned with alertness. Even retired, even weary, he watched the world as though it were still his duty to guard it. Samuel had come to depend on those eyes more than he admitted. They noticed things he missed. They reminded him of a time when life had meaning beyond tending a farm and remembering faces long buried. Tonight, though, something was different. Ranger wasn't sleeping. He wasn't even resting. He sat at the edge of the porch, body rigid, ears. He let the last of them go. Since then, the barn had become nothing but a relic, an echo of a life he no longer lived. Yet Ranger hadn't taken his eyes off it for hours. Samuel watched through the frost-streaked window, his coffee cooling untouched in his hands. At first he thought it was habit, the dog recalling patrols where every shadow could hide danger. But as the hours stretched and Ranger's posture never wavered, unease crawled up Samuel's spine. He set the mug down and rubbed his shoulder, a dull ache that flared when the weather turned. He'd taken shrapnel there during his last year on the force, chasing a suspect through broken glass. The injury had ended his career sooner than he'd planned, and though time had healed the wound, it never softened the memories. That same shoulder now throbbed as if warning him, echoing the tension in Ranger's stance. Samuel pushed back from the table. The house creaked in protest at his weight. He shrugged on his barn coat, its lining frayed, its elbows patched with fabric his late wife once sewed in for him. He caught himself staring for a moment at the photo above the fireplace, her smile still warm, her eyes steady. "You'd think I was foolish chasing shadows," he murmured to the empty room. "But he's never wrong, is he?" When he opened the front door, the cold slapped him like an old adversary. The air smelled of frost and damp wood. He pulled the collar higher around his neck, squinting at the barn across the field. Ranger's ears twitched at the sound, but the dog did not turn his head. His body remained coiled, as if tethered to something only he could sense. "You're still at it, huh?" Samuel muttered, stepping onto the porch. His boots scraped against the icy boards. Ranger gave a single flick of his tail, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement. A soldier receiving orders. For a moment, Samuel considered turning back, telling himself it was nothing, just a raccoon maybe, or the memory of horses. But the look in Ranger's eyes stopped him. It was a look Samuel hadn't seen since the city streets, since late nights when they'd been called to search collapsed buildings or track a missing child through alleys. It was a look that meant one thing: something's out there. The field stretched wide and silent between them and the barn. Dry grass, brittle with frost, crunched under Samuel's boots as he stepped off the porch. Ranger rose in perfect unison, his frame still carrying the dignity of service, and moved down the steps. He didn't run. Ranger never ran without cause, but he trotted with a quiet urgency, tail level, shoulders squared. Samuel followed, the breath puffing white from his lips. His hand instinctively brushed the utility knife clipped at his belt, a habit his eyes could not. The memory left his chest tight, both with nostalgia and dread. As they crossed the frozen yard, the barn loomed closer, its skeleton frame outlined against the storm-colored sky. The wind funneled through its gaps, making the walls groan like old men in pain. Samuel slowed, every nerve sharp now, mirroring Ranger's tension. The dog stopped just outside the door, his head lowered, a growl rising deep in his throat, not the warning growl of aggression, but the low hum of recognition. Samuel had heard it before, years ago, when Ranger had led him to a boy, trapped under rubble. It was a sound that said, "There is life here, and it's in danger." Samuel felt the hair rise along his own arms. The cold no longer bit just his skin. It sank deeper into bone, into memory. He reached out, laying a hand briefly on Ranger's back. The fur was coarse, warm, steady. "All right, boy," he whispered, voice tight. "Let's see what you found." The barn door creaked open under his push, its rusted hinges shrieking into the silence. A rush of stale air met him, thick with dust, straw, and something faint he couldn't name. Ranger slipped inside first, pausing at the threshold, like a soldier waiting for clearance. Samuel clicked on the flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. The barn swallowed them whole. Shadows stretched across broken beams and old hay bales. Harnesses hung like limp limbs, tools rusted to the walls. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. And yet, Ranger did not relax. He stood stiff, ears forward, breath fogging in the icy air, his amber eyes locked on the far corner. Samuel felt it then too, the weight of the silence, pressing, waiting, like the pause before something shatters. For the first time in years, Samuel's pulse quickened, not from age or regret, but from instinct. Something was here, something that did not belong. And in that breathless moment, as the wind rattled the walls and Ranger's growl deepened, Samuel realized this night was about to change everything. The house had settled into its familiar night sounds, the hum of the furnace, the faint crackle of wood in the stove, the steady ticking of the wall clock. But Samuel Hayes could not shake the feeling that something had gone wrong in the quiet. He leaned against the window frame, mug cooling in his hands, eyes following the shape of the old barn at the edge of the property. Ranger hadn't moved. The dog sat planted on the porch, muscles coiled, tail still as a line drawn in the dirt. His ears were locked forward, as if every nerve in his body was tuned to a frequency only he could hear. Samuel knew that look. He had seen it 100 times when Ranger was young. Dropped. He had tried to ignore Ranger's fixation for the past week, telling himself it was nothing more than the stubborn vigilance of a dog who had been trained too well to forget. But tonight was different. He pushed the curtain aside just a little more, the glass fogging under his breath. Ranger's head lifted slightly, as if sensing him watching. For a brief moment, the dog turned his gaze back toward the house, amber eyes glinting under the porch light. They weren't the eyes of a pet, they were the eyes of a partner asking for trust. Then, as if to answer his own unspoken question, Ranger swung his head back to the barn, unmoving, unrelenting. Samuel set his mug down hard enough on the counter that it clinked. The sound startled him in the stillness. He dragged the hand down his face, rough with stubble, and tried to shake off the memories stirring at the edges of his mind. But memories had their own way of returning, uninvited. And just like that, he was back there, flashback. It was 12 years ago, before the gray had crept into his beard, before the limp in his step slowed him down. He and Ranger had been younger then, both in their prime. They had been called to search the aftermath of an apartment fire, smoke still curling from broken windows, night sirens wailing. The building was unstable, but someone had reported a child missing. Samuel had hesitated at the threshold, the weight of protocol and caution pressing on him. But Ranger hadn't waited. The dog had pulled hard on the lead, dragging him toward a stairwell, half collapsed with ash. "Easy, boy," Samuel had muttered back then, even as his own lungs burned from smoke. But Ranger had known better. He led them to a closet door, warped from heat. Behind it, huddled in the corner, a little boy had waited, eyes glazed with terror, breaths shallow from smoke. They'd carried him out together, Samuel cradling the boy, Ranger circling them, barking at paramedics as if commanding them to hurry. That was Ranger's gift. He didn't just find what was hidden. He refused to let Samuel look away. Now, standing in the dim light of his kitchen, Samuel felt the echo of that night. The weight of small hands clinging to him. The sound of Ranger's urgent bark. The same unyielding focus in the dog's eyes as he stared down the barn tonight. The hairs rose on the back of Samuel's neck. He knew better than to dismiss it. Ranger was old, yes, but instinct never dulled. If anything, years of service had sharpened it. Whatever pulled him to the barn, it wasn't memory, it was presence. Samuel exhaled through his nose, long and slow. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to the dog waiting outside. "If you're telling me, I'll listen." He moved with the careful rhythm of a man who had done this too many times in another life. He never really stopped keeping ready. An old flashlight, its black paint chipped and faded from years of service. A utility knife, the kind that folded neatly but cut through rope and stubborn locks just as well as it did twine. His hand hovered over them for a moment. He thought of Margaret, his wife, and how she used to scold him for never leaving work at the station. "You're home now, Sam. You don't have to carry it all the time." But she'd been gone 7 years, and the tools were still there, because sometimes the world didn't care that you'd retired. Sometimes it came knocking anyway. He slipped the knife into his belt and tested the flashlight. The beam sputtered, then steadied into a white cone. He felt the familiar weight settle into his palm, the kind of weight that brought both reassurance and unease. At the coat rack, He grabbed the heavy barn jacket, the one patched at the elbow, the one that had seen more winters than he cared to count. As he slid his arms through the sleeves, the smell of earth and smoke clung to him. Ranger's ears flicked at the creak of the back door opening, as if he had been counting down to this moment all along. Samuel stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning beneath his boots. The night air bit sharp against his face, colder than it had been an hour ago. Ranger rose instantly, moving to his side, not with the spring of youth, but with the steady gait of a soldier who had never abandoned duty. "Still at it, huh?" Samuel said softly, his voice carrying only as far as the dog's ears. Ranger gave no bark, no whine, just a flick of the tail, quick, deliberate, as though saying, "You'll see." The barn loomed across the field, half lost in shadow. Samuel's eyes narrowed. For the first time in years, he felt the same sensation that once filled his chest before every call. Anticipation braided with dread. That heavy silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight and gave the night a nod, more ritual than habit. Then he whispered, "All right, partner. Lead the way." Ranger stepped forward into the frost, Samuel close behind, and though neither man nor dog could name it yet, they both knew. Something inside that barn was about to change the shape of their lives forever. The barn door groaned when Samuel pushed it open, its hinges shrieking like old bones that had forgotten how to move. The sound cut into the night, sharp and jarring, before fading into silence again. Cold air. Ranger pattered a few steps ahead, each paw placed with the caution of long training. His tail was low, body stiff, ears angled forward. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Not warning, not aggression, but that deep vibration Samuel had learned to recognize long ago. It meant one thing: life is here. Samuel's throat tightened. He swept the light again, forcing his breath to stay steady. The floorboards creaked under his boots, each groan echoing louder than it should, as if the barn itself resented intrusion. Then he heard it. Not loud, not even clear, just the faintest shuffle, like fabric dragging over wood. His heart jolted. He froze, straining his ears. There it was again, softer, almost swallowed by the wind leaking through the cracks. Ranger stiffened. His hackles lifted, ears quivering. Then, without hesitation, he moved toward the far corner, where old feed sacks lay slumped in a pile. He stopped just short, head low, whining in a tone Samuel hadn't heard since Bosnia. Mournful, urgent, pleading. Samuel's pulse hammered against his ribs. He stepped forward, flashlight beam jittering with his breath. The light caught something that didn't belong. A shape, small, tangled, curled in on itself like discarded fabric. For a moment his mind refused to understand, telling him it was straw bundled wrong, or perhaps a forgotten coat. But then the beam steadied, and he saw her. A little girl, no older than 6. She was curled tightly into the hay, knees pressed to her chest, as if she could fold herself out of existence. Her skin, pale beneath streaks of dirt, looked almost translucent under the light. Her cheeks were hollow, lips cracked, hair tangled in knots that hung across her face like a veil. She wore a pink dress, once festive, maybe for a birthday or a holiday, but now torn, the hem frayed and dark with stains of mud and straw. The thin fabric clung damply to her body. Samuel's heart seized so hard he couldn't breathe. For a long moment, he stood frozen. The world shrank to the sound of Ranger's whine, the beam of the flashlight, and the fragile figure before him. The weight of it hit him like shrapnel. A child, abandoned, freezing, broken in a way no child should ever be. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The girl stirred at the sound, one eye cracked open, glazed and unfocused. She tried to pull away, but her limbs barely obeyed. A small, broken sound slipped from her throat, more breath than voice. Fear flickered across her face before exhaustion dulled it again. Samuel crouched slowly, his knees protesting against the cold boards. He lowered the flashlight so it wouldn't blind her, and reached out with a trembling hand. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice breaking against urging him. "Do something. She doesn't have time." The girl's small chest rose and fell shallowly, each breath fragile as glass. Samuel slid his arms beneath her, careful as if lifting porcelain. She weighed almost nothing. Too light, far too light for a child her age. Her limbs dangled limp against his chest, her body radiating the kind of cold that seeped into bone. The shock of it cut him to the core. He had carried injured comrades before, felt the dead weight of bodies that wouldn't rise again. But this was different. This was a child, alone, left to the dark, like she was nothing. Samuel pressed her closer to his chest, pulling his coat around her thin frame. His jaw locked tight against the surge of grief and anger threatening to tear him open. He whispered more to himself than to her, "Not here. Not like this. Not on my land." The girl stirred again, eyelids fluttering, her lips parted, cracked and pale, and a faint whisper slipped out, "Daddy?" Samuel's throat closed. For a moment he couldn't answer. He looked down at her dirt-streaked face, at the hope clinging to a word spoken, half-conscious. He swallowed hard, his voice breaking as he murmured, "Not your daddy, sweetheart, but I'll get you to him. I promise." Ranger gave a low, approving sound, tail flicking once. Samuel rose, his arms tightening around the child. She was so small against him, so breakable, that every step felt like carrying both a burden and a vow. He turned toward the door, the beam of his flashlight swinging wildly now, forgotten. His only focus was the fragile life pressed against his chest. The cold night hit them as they stepped outside, sharper now, more merciless. Samuel barely felt it. Ranger trotted at his side, no leash, no command, just instinct, guarding them both as he had done all his life. The farmhouse lights glowed faintly across the field. Samuel quickened his pace, boots crunching over frost. His breath came hard, but his hold on the girl never wavered. Each step, each heartbeat echoed the same silent vow. "You're not forgotten. You'll never be alone again." Behind them, the barn stood in silence once more. But the darkness inside it had been broken, and for Samuel Hayes that night would mark the beginning of something he had long stopped believing in, a reason to fight again. The engine coughed once before catching, headlights slicing open the night like twin blades. Samuel shoved the old truck into gear, one hand tight on the wheel, the other cradling the fragile weight hanging by a thread. And it was now his thread to hold. "Stay with me, sweetheart," he muttered, his voice raw, as if the words alone could anchor her. Ranger shifted restlessly in the back seat, nails clicking against the worn vinyl, body trembling with tension. The dog's whines rose each time the truck slowed, at stop signs, at empty intersections, at the red light that refused to turn green. It wasn't the impatient whimper of a pet. It was the urgent keening of a partner who understood how close the line was between life and loss. Samuel pressed harder on the accelerator as soon as the light flipped. Tires spat gravel before gripping the cracked asphalt of the country road. His eyes flicked constantly from the girl in his arm to the frozen highway stretching before them. Each mile felt both too long and not long enough. The dashboard clock glowed faintly in the dark. 11:42 p.m. Too late for a child to be anywhere but bed. Too late for him to be racing through the night with someone else's daughter clinging to life in his arms. He could hear her breath, thin and uneven, rasping softly against the fabric of his coat. Every time the sound faltered, Samuel's own chest seized as if he could breathe for her. He had seen death before. Felt it in the silence of partners who didn't come back from calls, in the stillness of comrades who didn't rise after explosions. But this was a different terror. This was a child. And children weren't supposed to run out of time. He gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles whitening. His shoulder burned from the old injury, but he ignored it, every nerve focused on the road and the fragile life beside him. The town of Elhorn Ridge was 10 miles away. 10 miles of frost-bitten road, winding turns, and too many memories. Samuel drove like a man with nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. Ranger let out a sharp bark when the girl's body shifted slightly, a sound that jolted Samuel's heart. He looked down. Her eyes fluttered half open, glassy and unfocused. For a moment she stared up at him, lips parting as if to speak, but only a faint whisper of sound came. Cold. Samuel swallowed hard. I know, sweetheart. I know. Just hold on. We're almost there. Her small hand twitched against his chest before going still again. He turned his eyes back to the road, blinking against the sting building there. The headlights caught glimpses of the world rushing past. The black skeletons of trees, the pale sheen of frost on fences, the empty fields that seemed endless. All of it blurred into insignificance. The only reality was the child in his coat and the hospital light that still lay miles away. Memories pressed in despite his effort to keep them out. Years ago, he had carried another small body through the smoke of a fire. That boy had died. The crushing silence of a house too empty. The gnawing thought that he had no one left to save. Now here she was, a child who had no one else. Ranger's whine rose again as they hit the outskirts of town, where street lamps threw weak halos onto the pavement. Samuel pressed harder on the gas, the engine groaning in protest. The truck lurched forward anyway, carrying them through the sleeping streets. The hospital's red emergency sign finally glowed in the distance, faint at first, then brighter as they approached. Relief hit him sharp and dizzying, almost painful. But fear came with it. He wasn't done yet. Getting her there alive wasn't the same as saving her. He pulled hard into the drive, tires squealing. The automatic doors loomed ahead, a rectangle of light spilling into the night. Nurses moved inside, shadows in scrubs, unaware of the storm about to break into their quiet shift. Samuel braked hard, slammed the truck into park and flung open the driver's door. Cold air rushed in, burning his lungs as he stepped out with the girl clutched to his chest. Ranger leapt over the seat and landed on the asphalt beside him in one fluid motion. No command given. The child stirred weakly as Samuel jogged toward the entrance, his boots pounding against the ground. "Hang on, sweetheart," he whispered again, voice ragged. "Don't you dare give up on me." Inside, through the glass doors, a nurse turned at the sound of his approach. Her eyes widened as she saw the bundle in his arms, the man's desperation, the dog pacing at his side. The doors slid open. Warm air, antiseptic and sharp, washed over them. Samuel crossed the threshold, chest heaving, coat clutched tight around the fragile child. "She needs help," he said, voice breaking. "Now." The warmth of St. Mary's Hospital hit Samuel like a wall the moment he crossed the sliding doors, but it did nothing to chase the chill clinging to the child in his arms. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, too bright, too sterile, as though mocking the fragility of the small life wrapped in his coat. A nurse spotted them first. She was short, auburn hair pulled back tight, her hands already moving before she spoke. "Sir, this way, what happened?" Samuel's voice cracked. "Found her in my barn. She's freezing, barely breathing." The nurse's eyes flicked down at the bundle in his arms, then widened. She called out sharply over her shoulder, "Code blue." Lights. Skin so pale it seemed translucent, lips tinged blue, a faint tremor in her chest as she tried to breathe. "Vitals?" one nurse barked. "Pulse weak, shallow respirations. Temps dropping, she's hypothermic." Samuel stepped back, his legs heavy, his breath shallow as he watched them descend around her like a storm. Ranger pressed against his leg, nails tapping on the tile, eyes locked on the child. He whined low, pacing 2 steps left, then 2 steps right, as though every fiber of him fought the instinct to leap onto the gurney and guard her himself. A doctor shouldered his way through the flurry, tall, calm, his dark hair flecked with gray. A name tag pinned crookedly to his chest read, "Dr. Arjun Patel, Pediatrics." His eyes, sharp but steady, landed on Samuel for only a second before he turned to the girl. "What's her name?" Samuel shook his head. I don't know." Dr. Patel didn't flinch. "All right then, let's keep her breathing." His tone was even, as if steady words could keep chaos from swallowing the room. They cut away the pink dress, now stiff with mud and straw. Beneath, bruises bloomed across her thin frame, dark marks old and new. Samuel's fists clenched at the sight, guilt twisting sharp inside him. What if he hadn't followed Ranger? What if he'd told himself again it was just a dog's stubbornness, just memory? She would have died alone in that barn, forgotten. He pressed a hand to his face, blocking out the image, but it didn't leave. "Start warm IV fluids, get heated blankets, check for internal injuries," Dr. Patel instructed. His voice cut through the haze, firm and precise. Nurses moved swiftly, wrapping the child in blankets that looked far too heavy for her tiny frame. A line was started in her thin arm. Machines beeped to life, numbers flashing across the screen. Samuel stood useless, a soldier without orders. He had been trained to act in crisis, but this wasn't his battlefield. This was theirs. And all he could do was stand there, coat half off his shoulders, the scent of straw and frost still clinging to him, as strangers fought to hold on to the small breath of life he had carried through the night. A soft whimper pulled him back. Ranger had pressed closer, tail low, eyes fixed not on Samuel but on the gurney. The dog's body trembled, ears flicking each time Emily stirred under the lights. A nurse frowned. "Sir, the dog can't—" Dr. Patel lifted a hand without looking away from the child. "Leave him." His voice was firm. "He's calmer than half the parents I've met." The words sank into Samuel, unexpected, grounding him just enough to take one step forward. He gripped the rail of the gurney, leaning over. Her eyes fluttered then, thin lashes lifting to reveal irises glazed with exhaustion, but startlingly clear. For the first time since he'd found her, she tried to speak. Her lips trembled. Gaze drifted unfocused to the figure at Samuel's side. "Is he my guardian angel?" The words cracked something open inside him. His throat closed around the answer he wanted to give. He looked down at Ranger. The old shepherd had pressed his paws against the rail, amber eyes locked on the girl, his breath steady, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with hers, as though trying to teach her how to breathe again. Samuel swallowed hard. "Yeah, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice rough. "He is." Ranger gave the faintest thump of his tail, a quiet affirmation. The monitor's beep steady now, the line of her pulse faint but holding. Dr. Patel glanced up briefly at Samuel, then back at the girl. "She's stabilizing," he said. "Dehydrated, hypothermic, malnourished, but no internal damage we can see yet. She's strong." Samuel nodded numbly, but the guilt still gnawed. He thought of the week Ranger had been staring at that barn, the nights he'd told himself it was nothing, all the hours wasted when a child had been lying there alone. If Ranger hadn't refused to give up, if he hadn't gone out tonight. Samuel couldn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The girl's small fingers twitched against the blanket, reaching blindly. Samuel hesitated, then took her hand gently in his calloused one. It felt like holding air, fragile and fleeting. Her lips moved again, too faint for anyone else to hear. "Don't leave." Samuel bent closer, his voice steady even as his heart cracked. "I won't." Ranger settled at the foot of the gurney, lying down with his chin on his paws. His amber eyes never left her, as if daring anyone, doctor, nurse, or fate itself, to try and take her away. And in that sterile hospital bay, under the glare of fluorescent lights, a strange bond began to weave itself. Between a child who had nothing, a man who thought he'd lost everything, and an old shepherd who still believed his duty was not yet done. The pediatric room was quiet, save for the faint hiss of the heating vent and the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. The storm that Samuel had carried through the night had been replaced by a fragile stillness, like the hush after a battle when the smoke finally clears, but the air is still too heavy to breathe. Emily lay propped up on pillows, the hospital blanket pulled to her chin. The IV taped to her thin arm seemed too large for such a small body. Her eyes, clearer now, though rimmed with exhaustion, flicked toward Samuel as he pulled a chair close to her bedside. Ranger had already settled himself near the door, his body stretched across the linoleum like a sentinel. His hand those. For a while neither spoke. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft creaks of the building and the distant shuffle of nurses' shoes in the hallway. Samuel thought perhaps she'd fallen asleep again when her lips moved. "My daddy wears the green suit," she whispered, her voice thin, testing the air as if unsure it was allowed to exist outside her chest. Samuel leaned forward, careful not to startle her. "The green suit?" She nodded weakly. "The one with the shiny buttons. He said he had to go away, just for a little." Her small brow furrowed, confusion shadowing her features. "But it's been forever." The words pressed against Samuel like weight on his ribs. He knew the tone, children measuring time not by calendars but by the emptiness of waiting. Her eyes slipped down to the blanket, fingers plucking at the hem. "Mama Veronica, she yells a lot. When Daddy's gone. She doesn't like when I make noise." The name came out in a breath, but it landed sharp in Samuel's chest. Mama Veronica. He didn't know her yet. But the way the child's voice shrank around the words told him enough. "What does she say?" Samuel asked softly. Emily's lips trembled. She didn't answer at first, her gaze wandering toward the IV line, following it up to the bag above her head. Anywhere but his eyes. Then, so quiet he almost missed it, she said, "She says I'm in the way." Samuel's jaw tightened. He forced his face to remain calm, but inside something dark uncoiled. He thought of the bruises the nurses had uncovered, the way the little girl had flinched when strangers leaned too close. Rage simmered beneath his ribs, coiling with the helplessness he hated most. Emily pressed on, as if afraid the words might vanish if she didn't get them out quickly. "Sometimes she pushes. Not hard, just hard enough. I go hide in the barn so she can't find me." Her eyes lifted then, wide and glossy. "It's safe there. Was safe there. Until—" Her voice trailed off. Samuel swallowed, his throat thick. He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that no child should ever have to find safety in a pile of straw. But the words tangled in him. What good were assurances when her reality had been fear in her own home? Ranger's ears twitched suddenly. A nurse's footsteps passed by the doorway. The shepherd lifted his head, a low growl rolling from his chest, not loud, but enough. Two of them. The child with hollow cheeks, the old dog with eyes that had seen too much, and felt something shift inside him. He had told himself long ago that his days of saving people were over, that the world had no use for him beyond the chores of an aging farmhouse. But here was proof, fragile and undeniable, that he was wrong. He leaned forward, voice low but certain. "Emily," he said gently, using her name for the first time, letting it anchor them both. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you here. Not while I'm around. Not while he's around." Her eyes lifted again, cautious but searching.
"Promise?"
Samuel nodded, the vow heavy but unflinching. "Promise." The monitor beeped steadily, keeping time with her shallow breaths. Outside, the corridor hummed with hospital life. But in that small room, with Ranger standing guard and a child clutching at fur as if it were armor, a fragile trust began to take root. Samuel sat back in the chair, eyes still on Emily, and let the rage burning in his chest turn into something sharper, steadier. He had seen enough neglect, enough cowardice in his years to know one truth. People like Veronica didn't stop until someone made them. And as long as he breathed, he would not let her take another ounce of this child's safety away. The hallways of St. Mary's smelled faintly of antiseptic and brewed coffee, the kind that lingered on night shifts, when the world outside slept, but the hospital never did. Samuel moved slowly through them, his boots sounding heavy against the linoleum. In his hand, balanced awkwardly on a paper plate, was a slice of his apple pie, one of the few things he still baked since Margaret passed. He had wrapped it carefully in wax paper, as though its sweetness might soften the bitterness of what Emily had endured. He paused at the doorway of her room, steadying himself before pushing it open. Ranger was already inside, stretched out by the foot of the bed, like a shadow nailed to the floor. His ears twitched the instant Samuel entered, but he didn't rise. Instead, He lifted his head and thumped his tail once against the tile, a signal that all was quiet. Emily sat propped up against her pillows, knees pulled close beneath the hospital blanket. The color had returned faintly to her cheeks, but she still looked impossibly small in the wide bed. She was doodling with a stub of crayon on the back of a paper menu one of the nurses had given her. When she saw Samuel, her eyes brightened for a moment, shy but hopeful. "Brought you something." Fork she picked up. But she steadied it, took a tiny bite, and chewed slowly. When she swallowed, her eyes softened. "It's sweet." Samuel allowed himself a thin smile, but it didn't last long. His gaze had caught on something else, something that had slipped from beneath the blanket when she shifted to reach for the pie. A crumpled piece of notebook paper, folded into a tight square, its edges worn soft with handling. It had tumbled quietly to the floor, half hidden against the sterile white tile. "Careful there, sweetheart," Samuel said as he bent down, reaching to pick it up. He expected it to be a scrap from her drawing, maybe another paper animal like the nurses had helped her fold. But when he unfolded the creases, his breath caught. The handwriting was small, shaky, written in pencil pressed too hard against the page as if every letter had taken effort. Smudges blurred the edges, where small fingers had rubbed against the lines. In the center, scrawled uneven but unmistakable, were the words, "Dear Daddy, please come home. I'm scared." Samuel froze. The rest of the letter was harder to read, interrupted by smears of grape jelly, streaks of dirt, and the wobbling lines of a child trying to write through tears. "I don't like her. She yells. I hide in the barn so she won't find me. I miss you every day. Please come soon. Love, Emily." His throat tightened so suddenly he had to swallow hard just to breathe. The paper shook in his calloused hand. He imagined her writing it, tiny fingers clutching a pencil, hiding in the corner of a barn, whispering words she had no one else to tell, and then folding it up over and over, because she had no stamp, no envelope, no safe way to send it. A child's plea crumpled into silence. He looked up slowly. Emily had stilled, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth, her wide eyes fixed on the letter in his hand, terror flickering there like she'd been caught in a secret. "I was going to send it," she blurted, voice breaking, "but I didn't have a stamp." The fork clattered softly back onto the plate. Her small hands curled tight in her lap, shoulders hunching as though she expected scolding. "I tried to write neat," she added in a whisper, "so he'd read it." Samuel's chest ached. He sat back heavily in the chair, the letter trembling between his fingers. "Emily," he said, voice low, steady despite the storm in him. "You don't have to be afraid. No one's angry with you." Tears welled in her eyes, slipping hot paper carefully, smoothing the creases with his palm. "I'll make sure of it." Emily sniffed, eyes flicking toward him. "Promise?" He nodded once, the vow iron in his chest. "Promise." Ranger rose from his place at the door and padded closer, placing his chin gently on the mattress beside Emily's hand. She reached down, instinctively, tangling her small fingers in his fur. The trembling in her shoulders eased. Samuel leaned forward, resting the letter on his knee. He studied the smudged handwriting again, each uneven word stabbing deeper than the last. It wasn't just a note, it was proof of her loneliness, of her neglect, of her desperate hope. that someone would come for her, and now it was his responsibility to carry it. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's damp cheek. "You did good writing this," he told her softly. "Real good. It shows how brave you are." She blinked up at him, fragile but searching, as though testing whether he meant it. He gave a slow nod. "We'll get it where it needs to go. I'll see to that, myself." Ranger gave a quiet woof of agreement, tail brushing once against the bed frame. For the first time since he'd found her in the straw, Emily managed a small, unsteady smile. It was faint, fragile as paper, but it was there. Samuel looked down again at the crumpled letter, his jaw tightening. Somewhere out there was a father who deserved to know the truth, and somewhere out there was a woman who had done everything she could to bury it. But not anymore, not while Samuel Hayes still drew breath. The farmhouse wore the winter the way old men wear a heavy coat, close to the bone, familiar and a little too quiet. Frost latticed the kitchen window in fern-like veins. Beyond it, the fields lay flat and colorless, the barn a darker shadow on a sky that had run out of stars. Samuel let the back door ease shut behind him, careful with the hinge that squealed, as if even the house had grown sensitive to sudden noises. He set his keys in the chip blue bowl by the sink and stood still for a breath, listening to the sound of his own being home. The slow tick of the wall clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint settling of timbers that had learned his weight. The coat over his arm still held the cold, a hospital smell clinging to the wool. Antiseptic and something sweet, like apple pie that had cooled too long. He wasn't sure if that was from the slice he'd brought to Emily or from the memory of bringing it. Ranger came in behind him, a brushed whisper of paws across the mat, head briefly nudging Samuel's thigh as if to count him. Newspaper he hadn't managed to read, a ceramic mug with a ring of coffee gone cold, a square of wax paper he'd used to wrap the pie. He pulled a chair back and didn't sit yet, his hand still in the pocket of his coat, feeling the crumple of paper there. The letter he shouldn't have, perhaps, but couldn't leave behind. He slid it out, laid it on the oak. The creases were deep from too much folding. The pencil pressed hard as if each word had to be forced into existence. "Dear Daddy, please come home. I'm scared." The jelly stains had dried to a purplish transparency, the kind of mark you only get when little hands write where little hands eat, because there's no other table left in your world. Samuel smoothed the page with his palm and finally sat. The chair complained in a familiar way. He stared at the letter until the words blurred, then lifted his eyes to the mantel where the photographs lived. Margaret looked back at him from the frame on the left, her smile the same as it had been the day they'd pinned it there, a smile that always found the soft spots in him. In the picture, she held a stack of spelling tests to her chest, a cardigan falling off one shoulder, a strand of hair doing what it always did, impossible to tuck. School teacher to her marrow, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and the names of children's dogs. "You'd know what to say," he told her, voice finding its old habit with the empty room. "You'd sit on the edge of that hospital bed and make her forget what hurt for 5 minutes. He rubbed his thumb over a corner of the letter. Ranger curled down near the fire, forepaws crossed, head on his paws, a sentinel, off duty but not off watch. Each time Samuel sighed, the dog's ears ticked toward him, tiny acknowledgments, like a hand on a shoulder. The house held so many versions of silence. There was the quiet of mornings before coffee, the quiet that came after long days of repairs, when the body asked only for rest. And there was the other one, the colder kind, that had moved in 7 years ago and never fully left. When Margaret's slippers stayed under the bed and her voice stopped echoing down the hall, he'd learned to carry that quiet the way men carry old injuries, carefully, without letting it show, weather predicting weather. Tonight's silence was different. It had a pulse to it, like something had woken up inside these rooms, inside him, and was waiting to see what he would do next. He thought of Emily's eyes when she'd watched him read her letter. Not just the fear there, but the way hope flickers even in children who have no business knowing how hope works. He thought of Ranger standing at the gurney, breathing in rhythm, with a little girl who had forgotten. Didn't lift his head, only thumped his tail once. An agreement of forgiveness. Samuel rubbed the heel of his hand into his shoulder until the ache eased. The doctor's voice returned to him, calm, measured. She's stabilizing. Stabilizing isn't safe. Stabilizing is only the absence of a worse word. He found himself angling the letter so the light didn't cast a glare, tracing the wobble of the line that said, "I miss you every day." He could hear the sound of a pencil scratching on paper in a cold place. Words hurried in case footsteps came. It was a dangerous thing how children teach you your job without saying so. He had spent years convincing himself the work was behind him. You retire from a badge. You don't retire from recognizing a hand in the dark. He stood long enough to pour the cold coffee down the sink, ran water until it clattered, and then ran clear. When he turned off the tap, the clock resumed its authority. He dried his hands on a towel Margaret had embroidered with crooked daisies, thread faded to a paler yellow. She'd made a set of 6, 4 were gone. He'd never been able to throw the last 2 away. Back at the table, he folded the letter as neatly as the creases allowed and slipped it into a plain envelope from the drawer. He didn't write a name yet. Names had weight, and there was a right time to place that weight. Tomorrow had begun to organize itself in his head with the clean edges of action. Phone calls he could make, a box of old contact cards in the pantry, a woman he knew who knew a man who knew the right office to ask. He pictured the deputy who used to come to the youth program, hair always escaping its tie, her handwriting neat on forms. He pictured the barn again and felt his jaw set. "Not on our watch," he said, and the words felt less like a promise than a simple fact. The fire found its rhythm and filled the room with a patient warmth. Ranger gave a pleasure sigh only old dogs know how to make, the kind that says the floor is hard, but it will do. Samuel eased his boots off, towed them in beside the stove where they would be warm in the morning. He carried a blanket from the couch back to the chair and pulled it to his lap, the wool rough and comforting. He let himself drift a little, not to sleep, just into the kind of remembering that visits when a day has asked more of you than you had to give, and somehow you found it anyway. Margaret at the sink, humming the tune she never learned the words to, the clatter of 2 dinner plates instead of 1, a canine vest draped over a chair, Ranger younger and insistent at the door. Then the empty years, days measured in fence posts and feed store receipts, nights measured in the slow count of a man convincing himself he is enough company for himself. Some things you put away because they're over. Some things put themselves away for you. And some things, he glanced toward the envelope, come back without asking. He reached down and patted the floor in front of his chair. Ranger rose, joints clicking softly, and came to rest with his chin on Samuel's boot. The dog's eyes were half-lidded, but bright, as if sleep and watchfulness could live in the same place. Samuel's fingers found the fur behind one ear and worked there, slow and grateful. "Good work," he said. "You kept looking." Ranger's ears ticked again, a metronome to the small music of the house. The clock, the fire, the breath of a man and a dog who had learned one another's silences. Samuel leaned his head back and closed his eyes, not to escape, but to gather. Emily's face rose behind them, not as he'd found her, but as she'd looked when she tasted pie, surprised that something could still be sweet. He opened his eyes and looked at Margaret's picture one more time. "There's a child," he told her, "who needs a few of your tricks. I'll do what I can. You handle the rest." Outside, the wind shifted and let go of the house. Inside, the envelope lay where he'd placed it, weightless and heavier than anything else in the room. Tomorrow would want phone numbers and signatures, and the steadiness of a man who has decided he is not finished being useful. Tonight asked only that he keep watch. Samuel drew a deeper breath, let it out. Ranger's ears answered, that small twitch of understanding. The farmhouse did what it had always done. It held. And somewhere in its old bones, something long asleep opened its eyes. Emily hadn't brought light into the place so much as reminded the light how to behave. In the quiet, Samuel felt it find him, a thin line connecting his chest to the small hand that had clutched a dog's fur to steady her breathing. He pulled the blanket higher, laid his palm on the envelope, and kept his vigil until the fire hunkered down to coals. He wasn't a praying man in any formal way. But there are prayers that look like keeping your boots by the door, your coat on the chair, and your heart ready to move when the morning says, "Now." Ranger shifted once, closer, and sighed. Samuel answered with his own, and the house, old, stubborn, faithful, sighed with them. The fire had settled into a low, red hush, embers breathing in the grate like a sleeping animal. The farmhouse held its winter stillness, boards calm, clock steady, wind shouldering the eaves and then moving on. On the table, cards speckled with coffee, the edges thumbed down. Names he hadn't used in years, officers who'd retired, a dispatcher who'd moved south, a chaplain whose writing was so neat it felt like a kindness just looking at it. He sorted slowly until he found the card he'd been hoping hadn't gone stale. Colonel Margaret Stanton. Below the name, a cell number, and beneath that, in smaller hand, "Try evening. If urgent, try anyway." He checked the clock. Urgent counted. Samuel rubbed his thumb along the raised print, then reached for the landline, the old rotary one he'd never managed to replace. The dial clicked like a metronome as he turned it, a mechanical patience that made you commit to the number you were choosing. Ranger's ears turned with each click. On the third ring, a woman's voice came through, clear, clipped, awake in a way that made you think she always had been. "Stanton." "Colonel," Samuel said. He felt his voice go formal without trying. "It's Samuel Hayes." A brief pause, the past leafing through itself. Then, warmer. "Sam, I wondered if the mountains swallowed you. How long's it been?" "Too long," he said. He glanced at the envelope. "I wouldn't bother you unless—" "You're not bothering," she said, and he could hear papers shift, the sound of a chair being found. "Tell me what you have." He told her, not the barn the way it haunted him, not the way the pink dress had held to that small body, as if it could keep her from disappearing. Not how Ranger had breathed in time with the child to coax her back toward the world. He gave her the facts the way facts deserve. St. Mary's, female, approximately 6, hypothermic, malnourished, bruises in various stages of healing. Name, Emily. Father, Adrian Cole, Marine. Stepmother, Veronica. Angry, cold. The house, not a house. A letter unsent. Dear Daddy, please come home. I'm scared. Stanton let the silence stand where it needed to, which was something Samuel had always liked about her. When she spoke again, her voice lowered a notch. You have the letter? I do. He pressed his hand over the envelope again, as if it might settle the tremor in the paper. I'll get you a copy. All right. The sound of a pen uncapped. Listen to me. Locating an active-duty Marine is possible within channels, but alerting or contacting him through those channels, it's not as simple as calling a desk. We've got privacy regs, deployment statuses, command protocols, and a war's worth of red tape, even on good days. I understand. I'm not saying no. I'm saying there are...
The voice didn't reach for anything. It simply stated what was already true. She deserves her father back. Another quiet. He could picture Stanton's face, the way she used to study a situation before she moved, chin slightly down, eyes deciding. When she spoke, there was a grain of tenderness under the gravel. All right, Sam. He breathed out a thank you he didn't have to dress up. I can submit a welfare concern through family services and parallel a Red Cross emergency message if medical necessity is documented, she said, back in the language of getting things done. I'll need the hospital's attending to confirm condition in writing. I'll also need what you have, letter, any indication of neglect, names, dates, town, your statement. Dr. Patel, Samuel said, pediatrics. He'll tell the truth. The nurses will vouch. He hesitated only long enough to see if fear would get in the way. It didn't. And I'll give my statement. Good. Papers sounded like they were being stacked. If Cole's stateside, we can reach his command and arrange contact. If he's forward, it gets harder, but not impossible. The chain might push back. They always do when the sea looks calm from their side. The sea's not calm from hers, Samuel said. I know. Stanton's voice softened again. Sam, if there's neglect, child welfare will start their own storm. You're stepping into a fight that never stays at the edges. You ready for that? He looked at Ranger. The old dog had come to stand, not close enough to crowd him, not far enough to be anything but with him. Samuel set his free hand on the fur between Ranger's ears, felt the living heat there. I'm ready. All right. A small exhale, like a runner at the start. Can you fax me the letter tonight? Secure line? I don't keep a machine, Samuel said, almost apologizing. But the substation does. Deputy Jensen still works nights. She'll get it through. Good. I'll text you a number. She paused, and when she spoke again, the tone lost its uniform. How is the girl, Emily, now? Asleep when I left, he said. She ate pie. Not much, but enough to remember, sweet. She asked if Ranger was her guardian angel. Stanton half laughed, half swallowed the sound. Maybe he is. Maybe, Samuel said. You did right, bringing her in. The colonel's voice wore something like pride. You did right, calling me. I should have listened sooner, he said. And the admission cost him a little, as truth sometimes does. Ranger was telling me for days. I told myself it was memory. You listened when it mattered, she said. That's the only path for a single child. The old box of cards sat open like a little archive of favors and debts. He felt what he hadn't felt in a long time, useful. "I'll sit on this tonight," Stanton said, "and start the wheels first thing. If I hit a wall, I'll go under it. If I can't, I'll find someone who can. You'll hear from me as soon as I have his command, or him." "Thank you," Samuel said. 2 words, too small. But they were the ones he had. "For whatever it's worth, if you need me to sign something with a name on the line, you put mine there. I may take you up on that." She hesitated. "And Sam, get some sleep if you can. There's more day coming than night left." "Always is," he said. And they ended the call the way people do when they already said the important part. He set the handset back into its cradle and stood for a moment, with his fingers still curled around where the phone had been, as if the shape of the conversation might stay. Then he slid the envelope into his coat pocket again and reached for his boots. Ranger moved to the door before he did, head down, tail a slow metronome. "We're going to see Jensen," Samuel told him. "Then we're going to keep our promise." The old dog's ears lifted, a yes in motion. Samuel shrugged into his coat. At the mantel he touched 2 fingers to the glass over Margaret's smile, a salute and a prayer that looked like the same gesture. The fire offered one last lick of flame, and then held steady, as if agreeing to keep the house warm until they returned. Outside the night had sharpened. Snow sifted in the beam of the porch light, a fine silver dust. Samuel stepped into it and felt something in his chest uncoil. The waters might stir. Let them. He had a child's letter in his pocket and an old friend clearing a path through rules, and beside him, a shepherd who still believed in the job. They crossed the yard together, man and dog, boots and paws crunching in a shared rhythm, and the farmhouse settled behind them, faithful as a held breath. Morning didn't so much arrive at St. Mary's as it gently unfolded, first as a pale softness at the edge of the blinds, then as a wash of quiet gold that gave the white walls back a little warmth. The night shift murmur thinned. Carts squeaked by, coffee lids clicked shut, and somewhere down the hall a radio whispered a hymn that never quite broke into words. Emily woke to the small sounds first. The whisper of paper when Samuel set something on the tray. The soft thump of a tail against metal when Ranger recognized her stirring. The room's machines, steady, patient, kept their simple promises in green and blue. "Hey there," Samuel said, voice low, as if a loud word might bruise the morning. "Thought we'd tried breakfast the right little on the pillows." Hair mussed, eyes clearer than they'd been. She blinked at the slice, then at Samuel, as if to make sure it was really for her and not a picture she'd dreamed. "Pie," she said softly, the word shaped like wonder. "Doctor says food comes soft and slow," Samuel answered. "Pie can do soft and slow." Ranger had already moved. He rose from the mat at the door and padded to the bedside, folding himself carefully so his front paws rested against the rail and his head could reach the mattress. Emily's hand, small, still a little blue at the knuckles, went to his ears without thinking, fingers burying shyly into the fur like they belonged there and had been waiting to come home. Nurse Elena slipped in with a smile that felt like sunlight rehearsed. "Good morning, Emily. That looks important." She checked the line running into the child's hand, then her eyes flicked over the monitors with a practiced kindness. "We're going to try half of that now, okay? And some sips. We'll let your belly get used to happiness again." Emily nodded, obedient and solemn. She took the fork in both hands, anchor and oar, and carved the smallest corner free. When she tasted it, Her eyelids lowered in surprise. Sweetness touched her face the way warmth does, from inside out. She took another careful bite and then looked around as if to see who else had felt it. Ranger's tail beat once. Samuel's mouth found the ghost of a smile. Between bites, Elena laid a roll of paper on the tray, a bundle of crayons taped with a bow someone had cut from a ribbon, and a label that read, "Donated Child Life." The colors were wide and stubby, perfect for small hands that needed to remember how to hold joy. "Thought the room could use some pictures," Elena said. "Doctors are brave, but walls do terrible work as company." Emily touched the paper as if it might break. She picked up a crayon so deep a blue it could have been the sky before snow. Her tongue slipped to the corner of her mouth, and for a moment the world shrank to a white square and the certainty of a line becoming what you want it to be. She drew a curve, then another, the beginnings of a dog, a creature with ears too big and legs too long, except for the eyes, which she made very carefully. "That him?" Samuel asked. She nodded. "Ranger." Elena leaned in. "He's been your shadow," she said, as if confiding a secret. "We keep trying to tell him he's off duty. He disagrees." Her shadow, a passing tech, corrected from the doorway with a grin, counting a blood pressure cuff. "Belongs to her now." The nickname drifted down the hallway, and if this keeps up. Vitals strong. Keep the bites small. Keep the laughter real. Emily, as if on cue, breathed a laugh so careful it barely made a sound. Still, it rang in the room like a bell from far away, a tone people turned toward. Elena answered with a laugh of her own, bigger, so Emily wouldn't have to carry too much of the sound herself. "May I?" Emily began, and then stopped, cheeks warming. "What is it?" Samuel asked. She glanced at Ranger. "May I draw him with a cape?" Ranger's ears lifted at the word him. Samuel considered deeply, as if capes required paperwork. "Seems fair," he decided. "Angels wear what they want." She bent to her task, tongue tucked against concentration, blue giving way to red, red to yellow, yellow to a brown that was not quite the color of Ranger, but would do if you added love to it. When her hand tired, she pressed the crayon between her palms, as if keeping a little fire. Ranger, sensing the pause, nudged his nose under her wrist and held steady so she could rest there. The morning widened. Footsteps passed and returned. A volunteer hung a paper snowflake on the window latch. Somewhere a baby cried and was answered. Samuel read a few lines from the fairy tale book he'd started the night before, his voice catching on certain sentences for reasons only he knew. Emily listened, not always to the words, sometimes only to the way his voice moved through the air like something solid to lean on. "Again," she murmured when he stopped. He began again. At lunch, a tray came with applesauce and half a smiley face made of banana coins. Emily tried both, slow and curious, like a person testing the rules of a new country. "Sweet," she said again, and it felt like a prayer that had learned a second line. After, she slept briefly, a small hand still in Ranger's ruff, as if she feared drifting off might take her too far unless tied to something living. When she woke, Elena brought the kind of news that arrives on soft feet. "Dr. Patel says we can try sitting you up in the chair for a bit. Only if you want to. Only if your body says yes." Emily looked at the chair, plain, padded, with a folded blanket across it like a promise. She nodded once. Samuel slid an arm behind her shoulders and another beneath her knees, the way a man who has learned tenderness with age does. She weighed little, but the effort was not nothing. The body that had once carried men from fire now lifted a child from a bed, and the gravity of that was its own ache. He settled her, tucked the blanket around her legs. Ranger repositioned, head to knee, as if the chair had always been part of the plan. From the window, winter shone like a secret cap. His feet. She considered this, then reached for another crayon. Green, this time. The tender kind of green that knows it isn't spring yet, but believes. She drew a tree. Not a large one, but with a branch sure enough to hold a swing. Then a line that became rope. Then a curve that became a seat. She added a small dot for a person, and then, beside it, a not-quite-to-scale dog with a cape. Samuel watched her draw the rope twice, making it thicker. "Good idea," he said. "Safer that way." "Safer," she echoed, and the word seemed pleased to be spoken. By afternoon, the room held more color. 3 pictures were taped to the wall with medically approved kindness. A tree with a swing, a house with slanted roof and an improbable number of windows, and Ranger with a cape, labeled carefully in block letters, as if identity could be protected by spelling it right. Elena stood back with hands on hips. "I've seen worse museums," she pronounced. Staff slipped in and out, and with each entrance, Ranger gave a low vibration, not unfriendly, just a boundary drawn. Visitors learned to speak a notch softer, to move like they were stepping into a church or a nursery. "Her shadow," someone would say, and smiles would tilt toward the dog, who had decided the threshold belonged to one child, and, therefore, to him. Late afternoon brought the kind of quiet that holds its own breath. Emily's strength ran out all at once, the way children do, mid-sentence, mid-smile. Samuel lifted her back to bed, and Ranger stationed himself close enough to feel the heat of her small body through the blanket. She slept open-mouthed, one hand turned palm up, as if making space for something. Samuel sat with the book closed on his lap, looking not at the page, but at the soft rise and fall of a chest that had, for too long, learned to be careful about breathing. He let the day replay in him. The first bite, the first laugh, the pencil blue eyes of a dog drawn with too much love to be anatomically correct. He felt something loosen under his ribs, something that had been clamped there for years. Not all the way. Grief is a thing that knows its rights, but enough that air moved differently. Elena came back with evening coming on her shoulders. "How's our girl?" "Asleep," Samuel said. "Good." She adjusted a line by habit, smoothed a wrinkle from the sheet. Before she left, she touched 2 fingers to the new gallery on the wall. "I like the one with the tree," she said. "Me too," Samuel answered. "Believe in mornings." Samuel sat a while longer, hand resting on the book, eyes on the little open palm. Pie, crayons, a laugh that could be heard if you leaned in. Fragments, yes, but put in the right order, fragments make a home. He stayed until the clock forgot to matter. And when he finally stood, the chair remembered him, and the bed held her, and the dog watched the door, as if no other job had ever made more sense. Outside the window, the bird had gone, and the sky had turned the color of a bruise healing. Inside, a child slept in a room that had learned a new word and decided to keep it. Safe.
Evening had a way of softening the sharp edges of St. Mary's. The hum of daytime gave itself over to the hush of dimmed lights and slower footsteps, as if the building itself practiced breathing exercises after sunset. In Emily's room, the blinds were tilted just enough to let in a band of blue twilight. A paper crane someone had folded at lunch hung from a bit of tape near the window, moving when the heating vent sighed. Ranger lay stretched along the floor with his shoulder pressed against the bed frame, her shadow holding the line. His ears twitched when the hallway cart rattled by, then settled again. Samuel sat in the chair he'd come to think of as his, sturdy enough for his back, close enough that a hand could land on a small forearm, without leaving the child's reach. On his knees, he balanced a book, Margaret's book, the cover softened by years of second graders, and the kind of hand that turned pages, as if each one had a heartbeat. "You ready for a story?" he asked, low, the way you speak to a candle you don't want to blow out. Emily nodded. The blanket had climbed to her chin. Her hair had found the shape of the pillow and stayed there. The new crayons lay in a tidy row on the tray, their wrappers peeled only a little, like fruit waiting for morning. Samuel thumbed the book open. Inside the front cover, Margaret's name curved in blue ink, the J looping back on itself like a ribbon. Beneath it, a habit she'd kept in every book, small notes penciled in the margins. Ask them if the fox is brave or lonely. Pause here. This line makes them laugh. He felt the old ache and the new mercy in the same breath. "How about the one with the fox?" he said. "The one who lost his tail and found something better." Emily's eyes brightened. "Is it better?" she whispered. "Depends who's telling it," he said, smiling with only one corner of his mouth. "Let's see what it says tonight," he began. His voice smoothed out on the second paragraph. It rested in the air between sentences, where the small listener could turn it over without explanation. Emily listened with her head tipped slightly, the way children do when the world is trying to make sense and you've decided to allow it. She glanced once at Ranger as if to check whether he approved of foxes, and satisfied with a slow sweep of his tail, settled deeper into the pillows. A soft knock came. Elena eased the door open with a nurse's grace, a cup in one hand, a grin tucked just behind her professionalism. "I heard there was a good storyteller on this floor," she whispered, setting the cup on the tray.
Warm water with a whisper of honey. Doctor's orders, but don't tell him I called it honey.
"Thank you," Samuel said. "Age 3 always gets them,"
she added, pointing at a margin note. "Pause here, they'll gasp."
"Carry on." She slipped out again, her shoes silent conspirators. Samuel did as instructed. On page 3, he paused. Emily's small gasp, soft, surprised, delighted, arrived right on time, and he felt a laugh rise in him so old it felt new.
"Another?"
she asked when the fox's problem had become a path, and the path felt like a promise. "Another." He turned to a story Margaret had loved for reasons she never explained, about a small lighthouse that kept shining even when the fog grew jealous. He'd always thought it a bit on the nose for children, but Margaret's notes said they understand more than we do, and this seemed as good a night as any to be wrong in that direction. He read slower now. Between sentences, he looked at the child and saw the day on her face, the pie, the drawings, the way she'd made the swings rope twice as thick because safe was a thing you could sketch into being if your hands stayed steady. Ranger's breathing had settled into a metronome. Emily's followed it, a little delayed, like a harmony learning its part. When the lighthouse had done its duty for the third time, because stories know to give us more than we deserve, Emily's hand crept toward the edge of the mattress. Without looking, Ranger lifted his paw, heavy and warm, and set it where her fingers were searching. She rested her hand over his, small on large, bone and fur, and something older than either. The monitors gave their green constellations a little brighter glow, as if approval could be electrical. Samuel stopped reading. He didn't say he had. He just let silence act like a paragraph break. Emily's eyes were half-lidded now, the lashes a dark line against skin that had remembered color these past 2 days. Her mouth went slack at the corners, which in children is the first surrender to sleep.
Without sound. The room was dim enough that Margaret's name on the inside cover was only a suggestion of ink. He held the book a moment longer than he needed to, the way you hold a door for a memory, and then laid it on the tray beside the crayons, as if words and colors were cousins. "Thank you," he said, "to the room, to the night, to the dog, to the child, but mostly to the woman who had taught him how to read aloud without hurrying the heart." He leaned back in the chair and let the ache move through him honestly. It didn't ask permission, and he didn't ask it to leave. His eyes stung. Tears threatened in the stubborn way old men's tears do, halfway between resistance and grace. He looked up at the ceiling, and then, because it felt more like her, at the space just left of the window, where he could imagine Margaret standing with her cardigan slipping, and that same rebellious strand of hair escaping the order she asked of it. "You were right," he whispered. "They understand more than we do." Ranger's ear ticked. Emily's fingers, even in sleep, tightened briefly, then loosened again. Samuel bent forward and adjusted the blanket that didn't really need adjusting. He made sure the IV line had room to be itself. He brushed a single strand of hair from Emily's forehead, the way fathers do, and teachers do, and men who never thought they'd be either, somehow learned to. "Thank you," he said again, and this time he meant it, directly to Margaret. "For the stories, for leaving me instructions in the margins." A minute passed, maybe 5. Time in rooms like this behaves like a patient dog, loyal, circling, then lying down where you tell it. The monitors kept their vigil. The hallway whispered its small commerce. Somewhere a radio offered the last 2 notes of a hymn, and then decided against the rest. Samuel let his head fall back against the chair. He didn't close his eyes all the way. He looked at the joined shapes on the bed, child and paw, and felt something like a door inside him unlock. Not a door he closed out of anger. The kind you shut gently because the room behind it holds too much weather. It swung now without creaking. "Rest," he said. So softly the word might have been a thought. "We'll keep watch." Ranger answered with a breath so deep it sounded like agreement. Emily's mouth parted a fraction more. The paper crane stirred as the vent exhaled, a tiny ship on an invisible tide. Samuel stayed until the next hour, forgot its name. Then he took the book again, not to read, but to hold, and bowed his head over it. Under the noise of machines and the hush of plaster and paint, he said his thanks a third time, the way a go side by side. Afternoon thinned itself across the window, the light the color of paper left in a drawer too long. The hospital had gone to its quieter voice, the one used between medicine and sleep, when Samuel slid his chair closer to Emily's bed. Ranger had taken up his post as if the floor itself had asked him to, one paw just touching the sheet, head angled so he could see the door and the child without moving anything but his eyes. Emily had drawn herself tired. The pictures, tree, swing, house with too many windows, were taped along the wall like a map someone might follow home if they forgot the turns. Now her crayons rested in their row, wrappers peeled a little more than in the morning. She lay on her side, face turned toward the small parade of color, blanket pulled to her shoulders. Somewhere down the hall, a television murmured the weather for people who hadn't stepped outside all day. Samuel set a paper cup of water on the tray and rested his hands together, knuckles folded like he was about to pray and had changed his mind. He waited. He'd learned long ago that children will step into silence if you let the silence be kind. "Mr. Samuel?" Emily's voice came like a note that wasn't sure of itself yet. "I'm here," he said, soft. She glanced at the door and then at Ranger, as if asking what could be told when a doorway existed. Ranger answered by shifting an inch closer and sighing a deep, dog-true sigh. "It's all right. Tell him." Emily's fingers crept toward his ruff and disappeared there, as if words needed something warm to hold to. "I used to hide," she said. Samuel didn't move. "Where, sweetheart?" "In the barn," she whispered, as if the walls might tell on her. "Back home, when Mama Veronica would get loud, when she was quiet too." She swallowed, the small sound of it traveling the thin distance between them. Quiet was worse. "Because you didn't know if the storm was coming," Samuel said, not asking, just naming the weather. Emily blinked slowly, surprised he'd said it right. "She doesn't like noises," she went on, "or crumbs, or shoes by the door, or when I sing." Her mouth moved once, then closed. "Sometimes she pushes. She says it's not a push if I don't fall." Samuel's hands pressed together harder to keep from shaking. The ache in his right shoulder flared and died, like an old radio catching a station and letting it go. "How long have you been hiding in the barn?" "A long time," she said. And then, because children measured days with you, he asked, careful with the question, careful with the air. "My bear," she said. A tiny smile tried to happen and then thought better of it. "He's brown, but his ear is flat, because he got chewed. Not by me." She paused. "And my necklace." She lifted a hand to the hollow of her throat, finding only skin. "The white beads with the letters Emily. That's me." She tapped her chest once, as if to prove the spelling matched the person. Samuel's gaze followed her hand, and something inside him clicked, the old click from the days when facts arranged themselves and you only had to be patient enough to let them. "Where are they now?" he asked, though he suspected the kind of answer that hurts to hear. Emily's eyes slid sideways, as if looking at a place only she could see. "Mama threw them away," she said matter-of-factly, the way children report weather. "She said bears make rooms look messy, and necklaces make you look like you're asking." The last word snagged. She pushed it past her teeth anyway. "Asking for trouble." Ranger's ears tipped forward. A low thrum rolled up from his chest and stopped in his throat. Nothing anyone would call a growl, just a line drawn in a sound only adults understood, if they remembered how. Samuel took in a breath that didn't feel like it had room to fit. He kept his voice level. "She threw them away in the house?" Emily shook her head. "In the big can by the fence. But I got them back." Something like pride lit for a second in her face. "I washed the bear with the hose, but he still smelled like dirt, and Mama said that's why she threw him away again. The necklace got stuck in the straw. I kept it safe under the ladder. It's dark there, but you can hear the road if you listen with your cheek on the floor." She demonstrated, cheek to pillow, as if memory asked for posture. Samuel felt the room change temperature, not the thermostat kind, the kind inside a man when the map of what needs doing draws itself with thick black lines. He pictured the barn in sections, the feed sacks, the ladder, the space under, the way straw holds on to small things and tire tracks print clean when the ground is right. He felt his body shift toward motion while remaining perfectly still. In the corner of his mind, names sorted themselves. Carla Jensen at the substation, the old evidence bags in the deputy's drawer, Dr. Patel's clean signature on a form if a form turned out to be required by stubborn people who preferred paper to truth. Emily's hand had gone back to Ranger. Her fingers worked in slow, thoughtful circles, the way nervousness turns to occupation when given a job. Pick words from air that didn't want to be picked. "My tummy got small. When I'm small, I'm not in the way." Samuel closed his eyes and opened them again, which is a thing men do when they have to let fury move through without breaking what's nearest. "You are never in the way," he said, small and fierce. She regarded him then the way some animals do when deciding whether to trust the hand that unlatched the cage. After a few heartbeats, she nodded, one, then another, like she was allowing the sentence to sit with her until it could be tested. "Do you think Daddy knows?" she asked, so quietly, the machines seemed rude. "I don't think he does," Samuel said, "but he will." Her mouth shaped the next word before her voice brought it. "How?" "I asked a friend to help me find him," Samuel said. He could feel Stanton's name like a steady rock in his pocket, even if the room didn't need the detail. Sometimes grown-ups make a lot of phone calls. Sometimes that's the same as knocking on a door until it opens. Emily considered this ritual of adult sorcery. "Will he be mad?" she asked. "I hope you'll be back," Samuel answered, which was as honest as he could be, without borrowing tomorrow's certainty. The hall gave them 2 sets of footsteps and a voice, paging a doctor to radiology. Ranger lifted his head and made that quiet sound again, the boundary line laid down and respected, then settled. The room exhaled with him. Emily looked past Samuel toward the window where the light had thinned itself nearly out. "When I hid," she said, "I counted trucks. I made up names for them so I wasn't alone. One of them had a squeaky wheel like a mouse, and I called him Squeak." The smallest smile found its footing. Sometimes Squeak came twice. "Squeak has good taste," Samuel said. She glanced at the drawings, at the tree, at the house, at the dog in a cape, and then back to him. "If we go back there," she said, the "we" landing like a gift, "will we find my bear? And the necklace?" She touched her throat again, that empty place, waiting to be named. Samuel didn't let his answer get ahead of his face. "We'll try," he said. "We'll bring a good flashlight and better eyes. Ranger's got both." At his name, the shepherd lifted his head, amber gaze moving from Samuel to the child and back again, as if asking whose order he should follow when the orders were the same. Emily's fingers pressed deeper into his fur, and he accepted the promotion without comment.
Samuel reached for the notepad on the tray, the cheap kind, with a hospital logo and a pen that stuttered once before cooperating. He wrote in a block hand that had filled forms and reports before.
"Write like Daddy," she said. "Like the letters stand up straight so they won't fall down."
"I'll take that," Samuel said, and tucked the note in his pocket beside the letter that had started all of this moving. The light slipped one more degree toward evening. Elena appeared briefly, a check and a smile, the practiced magic of nursing that reads rooms the way some read poems. She didn't ask what had been said. She touched the blanket at Emily's shoulder and left them to the quiet that still had work to do. "Thank you for telling me," Samuel said when the door hushed shut again. "It helps." Emily nodded into Ranger's neck. "He makes it easier," she murmured, words threading into fur. "That's the idea," Samuel answered. He sat there while the machines kept tempo, while the child's body remembered how to be tired without being afraid. In his chest, the old engine turned over and caught, the one that starts when a man has a purpose and the tools to point at it. He thought of the barn and the ladder and the way straw gives up secrets if you ask it right. He thought of a deputy who kept a straight back and a notebook in her pocket. He thought of a bear with a flattened ear and a string of white beads that spelled a name no one would throw away twice. Ranger blinked at him, slow, a soldier's nod. "Tomorrow," Samuel said, not to hurry the night, but to give morning its orders. "We go back." Dawn came thin and colorless, a pale band unfastening night from the hills. Frost webbed the grass, and the old barn wore its age without apology, paint long gone, roof sagging, boards breathing cold. Samuel stood on the porch with hands in pockets, feeling the weight of what morning asked. Ranger waited at the steps, muscles coiled, old instincts intact. "Let's go, partner," Samuel said. They crossed the yard, boots and paws crunching rhythm into frozen ground. Samuel carried the small things that mattered: flashlight, gloves, cord, bags, a notepad list. Margaret had once teased him for his lists, but he knew better. Lists weren't fuss, they were mercy. Ranger reached the barn first, pausing at the door, nose low. A single woof. Here. Samuel eased the door open. Hinges screamed. The smell, stale straw, mouse, iron, rot, rolled out. Flashlight on, he swept dust and shadow. Harnesses slumped like tired shoulders. A rake leaned where hands had left it years ago. His beam found the ladder in the corner. Ranger moved toward it, claws quiet. Samuel knelt, straw whispering under gloves. The floor gave back a hollow where a child had once curled, a shape that asked to be missed. Ranger stopped, ears pricked, paw lifted. Pointer's patience. Samuel followed his gaze. Something shone faintly. He brushed straw aside and uncovered a custody was just another way of saying, "Don't forget where truth came from." Ranger had already moved to a tarp on a low shelf, a soft whine. Samuel lifted the edge. A bear looked back. Mud-colored now, one ear flattened, a patch clumsily stitched by small hands. "You did your job," he whispered. He bagged it, labeled shelf, tarp, bear, ear. The loft beams and dust constellations watched in silence. Samuel's jaw ached from clenching. "Anything else?" Ranger checked the corners, then froze at the threshold. Samuel followed his line of sight. 2 clean tire arcs cut the frost by the yard. Narrow tread, compact SUV maybe. They'd driven in, circled tight and left. Not a visit, a drop. Samuel crouched, palm hovering the imprint. Frost edges still sharp. Overnight, maybe 2. He photographed them. Wide shot, close tread, knife for scale. "You didn't wander." he said softly to the child in the hospital. You were brought. Inside, he touched the floor hollow once more. We found it, kid. Your name, your bear. We're bringing them to you. Ranger pressed his head against Samuel's shoulder. Weight modest, infinite. Samuel sealed the barn, evidence secure in his pocket. At the porch, he looked down the drive. We see you, he said into the cold. Then he called, Sheriff Substation. It's Sam Hayes. I've got a necklace, a bear, and fresh tracks. Carla, can you come? On my way, she answered. Minutes later, her SUV arrived. Compact stride, squared shoulders, badge worn like a promise. She greeted Ranger first. He thumped his tail once. Inside the barn, Samuel showed her. Necklace under ladder, bear beneath tarp. Bagged, labeled, he said. Didn't touch more than that. You remember your training, Carla replied, photographing wide and close, setting evidence markers. Walk me through it like I've never seen a barn. He did. She logged the chain of custody, names in order. Carla measured tread width, distance. Compact SUV. Tires less than 6 months old. Edges still crisp. Fresh, overnight. She straightened. That's a drop. They worked methodically. Photos, casts, fibers from tarp, dirt from ladder. Samuel handed over Emily's crumpled letter. Carla unfolded it slowly, lips tightening at, Please come home. I'm scared. She slid it into sleeves. That's probable cause, and enough heart for a jury. We'll open a neglect case, issue a bolo on Veronica. DMV cams, tire matches, medical reports. We'll find her, she said firmly. Ranger bags beside Samuel. He touched the plastic, reassured it hadn't vanished into story. Emily had already reached for the beads at her throat, eyes wet with relief. He carried that image like fire against the wind. Carla's text came. Letter logged, cast poured, bolo issued. He replied simply, here if needed. Back home, he set the bags gently on the table. The kettle hissed. Ranger patrolled the windows, ears twitching. Samuel checked the bolts, slid the chain, and turned on the porch light. The barn loomed dark through the frost. Carla had been blunt. We can't put hands on her. Veronica was gone. County lines porous, back roads plenty. The kind who loved herself most could stay lost, if she wanted. Ranger stiffened at the side window, fur bristling. Samuel grabbed the old flashlight. Its beam swept the yard, over fences, swings, and gardens. Stillness. But stillness wasn't safe. A storm is coming, he muttered. Snow began as silver dust, drifting sideways. The radio murmured weather warnings. Headlights flashed once across the walls, too fast, gone again. Rangers growled low until they faded. Not her. Not yet. Samuel slipped Emily's copied letter into a drawer, safe for her father when he was found. Ranger pressed his nose to Samuel's palm, then back to the door, reminder that hope and caution share a fence. He spread a wool blanket over the vigil chair, set flashlight and phone on the table. Colonel Stanton's card, half visible. Ranger paced door to window, then lay facing the hinge itself. Snow thickened. Wind leaned on the house. Samuel lifted his mug toward Margaret's photo. We're doing the best we can. The world's pushing back. Carla's last words steadied him. This will stir up some folks. Let it. I'll be in front where I can, beside you when I can't. Stanton's promise echoed behind.
Between them, he felt less alone than in years. "Storm ahead," Samuel whispered, this time meaning both the sky and the woman still out there. Ranger answered with a soft note, the same sound that had led him to a child in straw. The house breathed its patience. The clock kept time. Outside, snow marched in silence. Inside, two old partners kept watch, waiting not in fear, but in resolve. The courthouse looked smaller up close. 2 stories of faded brick, a clock that lagged 3 minutes behind, steps worn down by decades of boots and handcuffs. Inside, the air smelled of lemon oil and damp wool, radiators clanking like throats clearing history. Samuel held the door for Emily. She wore the pale blue sweater Elena had chosen, sleeves long to hide her hands. Her hair was braided neatly with ribbons, like dawn. She gripped Ranger's collar, her support animal by order of the judge. The old shepherd walked with the solemn patience of a soldier who remembered battlefields. The gallery was half full, townsfolk in Sunday jackets, 2 reporters, the postmaster, a teacher Samuel knew. At the prosecution table, ADA Nora Bellamy stacked her files. A box beside her held 3 pieces of evidence: a flattened-eared teddy bear, a beaded necklace spelling Emily, and photos of tire tracks in frost. Detective Carla Jensen waited in the aisle, badge glinting, exhaustion etched around her mouth. Emily clung to Samuel's hand. He bent close. "You're not alone. Look at your feet." Ranger had curled under the bench, one amber eye on the door, the other on her. His shoulder pressed against her ankles until her breath steadied. Then the doors opened. Veronica entered. Perfect hair, beige coat, diamonds sharp as glass. Flanked by Curtis Vale, her lawyer. Red tie loud as curtains. She scanned the gallery like a market, but when her eyes met Ranger's unblinking stare, she looked away first. "All rise." Judge Marlene Hargrove entered, thin as a fence post, eyes sharp enough to pare an apple. "We are here on the matter of State versus Veronica Cole. Charges: reckless endangerment, child neglect, abandonment." Nora rose. "What you will hear is simple. A 6-year-old child, hypothermic, malnourished, bruised. A stepmother who preferred silence to care. The law requires the bare minimum." She failed. Vale countered. Veronica was overwhelmed, not malicious. Sympathy, he argued, was not proof. The witnesses came. Nurse Elena Morales testified. Emily scavenged food from trash, hid in a barn to escape Veronica, her body marked by old and new bruises. Dr. Patel confirmed, sustained neglect, not accident. Then Samuel was called. He told it plainly. Ranger's stare at the barn, the child in the straw, whispering, "Daddy?" when he wrapped her in his coat. He showed the necklace and teddy bear he found, the tire track circling the barn. Finally, he unfolded a letter in Emily's handwriting. "Dear Daddy, please come home. I'm scared. I don't like her. I hide in the barn so she won't find me." Defendant guilty. Relief swept the gallery. Custody was stripped. Temporary guardianship went to Samuel Hayes. "You are not blood," the judge told him, "but you have been what children know when they see it: safe." Emily pressed into his sleeve, her sob caught between fear and relief. Ranger's tail brushed her shoe, steadying. Outside on the courthouse steps, she whispered again, "We won." Ranger leaned against her leg, an old soldier with a new duty. Winter pressed against the hospital windows that night. On the pediatric floor, Emily slept curled,
Ranger beneath her bed, eyes lifting at every sound. A knock came. A man entered, snow on his coat, duffel slung, fatigue etched in his face. Marine utilities peeked from his collar. Hazel's eyes went straight to the bed. "Adrian Cole?" Samuel asked. The man nodded. Ranger stepped forward, sniffed, then wagged once. "You belong." Emily woke up. "Daddy," she whispered. Adrian knelt. She ran into his arms, teddy bear crushed between them. He buried his face in her hair, making the sound of men who weep quietly. "I'm sorry," he said over and over. "I didn't know. I'm here now." "It's okay," she whispered. "We had pie." He laughed through tears. Later, when she slept against his chest, Adrian confessed. Overseas deployments, rationed calls, believing Veronica's lies because he needed to believe the world was kinder than it was. "I told myself she cared. She wasn't." Samuel's voice was steady. "She doesn't need perfection. She needs you." Adrian nodded, clutching his daughter tighter. "I can do it now. I'll learn the rest." Ranger thumped his tail. The vow was made. Spring loosened winter's grip. Samuel helped Adrian repair a small house down the road, leaks patched, walls washed, Emily's room painted robin's egg blue with one wall left white for her drawings. A swing hung from the maple out front. Neighbors arrived with kindness. Elena with groceries, Carla with smoke detectors, Nora with papers, the school teacher with crayons and books. Emily's first drawing, a house and a dog with ears too big, was taped proudly to the wall. Ranger approved with a solemn wag. When she came home from the hospital, she touched the walls like a traveler learning a new country. "Which is mine?" she asked. "That one," Adrian said softly. Her smile broke the house open. But healing was not simple. A slammed door made her flinch. A kettle shrieked too loud. Adrian ached, sanding boards too hard. "I thought court was the hard part. Turns out it's this, standing in a kitchen when
"They're clapping for the idea of you," he said. She whispered, amazed. "They know my name." Ranger leaned steady against her leg. At last came the day of discharge. Elena dressed Emily in a soft pink dress, ribbons in her hair, the mended teddy bear tucked under her arm. Outside the hospital, Samuel waited with daisies, Adrian with a plaid shirt that couldn't decide on one shade of hope, and Ranger sitting proud, tail thumping time. Emily stepped through the doors and ran into her father's arms. "Extra sky freckles," she whispered into his shirt, and he laughed cleanly for the first time in months. They drove home together, man, father, child, and dog. Neighbors waved from porches. The grocery boy lifted a carton labeled for pancakes only. When the truck stopped at the small house, Emily stood on the porch, looked at the swing, the robin's egg walls, the hook waiting for her necklace. "Home," she said. "Home," Adrian echoed. "Home," Samuel confirmed. Ranger trotted ahead, sat on the top step, chest forward, tail steady, as if to mark the moment in history. Inside, Emily taped her hospital drawing of a swing and a caped dog named Ranger to the gallery wall. Ranger studied it, then thumped his tail once. Approved. That night, they made blueberry pancakes together. "Sky freckles," she called them, and ate standing at the counter, laughing until solemnity itself gave up. Later, Emily slipped her hand onto Ranger's paw. "Thanks for finding me," she whispered. His tail answered with 2 slow thumps. And so the house learned its new language, clouds painted on the walls, pancakes in the skillet, a swing that promised safety, and a mended bear listening at the bedside. For the first time in years, the future didn't look like weather.
It looked like a road. At last, they stood again at the first threshold, where outside and in trade news. The porch had warmed under the noon sun. The jar on the rail haloed the daisies, and a bee investigated as if considering membership. Ranger took the top step, angled to see both the road and family. Emily hovered with a hand on his collar, not to hold him back, but so the first story they told this house would be told together. Adrian looked at Samuel, eyes bright in a way that owed no debt to tears. "Thank you," he said. No flourishes, a carpenter's 2 words, square and true. Samuel tipped his head toward the blue room where the drawing had taken its place. "All I did was hold the tape," he said. "You two did the sticking." Emily pressed her cheek to Ranger's neck and looked out at the swing, then back to the wall where the tree already grew. "Can we make more pictures?" she asked, urgency and contentment miraculously sharing a sentence. "Every day we stay," Samuel said. "That's what pictures are for." The wind came up gently from the creek and slipped through the screen, nosing the daisies, ruffling the ribbon, lifting the paper edges on the gallery strip so they whispered against paint like pages turning. The house listened and learned the sound, not sirens, not hinges misbehaving, but the soft, durable noise of a life beginning again, exactly where it should, right at the threshold, with a dog's steady breath at your knee and your own work on the wall. By summer, the maple had learned a deeper green, the kind that holds shade the way a hand holds water, carefully, generously. Noon came soft and honest down the gravel spur, and the small house, which had once tried to disappear into its own lean, now sat forward on its crooked porch as if to greet whatever the day might set gently on its steps. In the yard, the rope swing drew a bright arc between earth and sky. Emily skimmed it like a swallow, up, pause, back, her feet bare, her legs pumping with the fierce, uncomplicated certainty of 6. The pink dress had been traded for shorts and a shirt with a sun-stitched small, the hem stained with grass and the serious work of lemonade. The necklace lay warm at her throat, beads spelling out a name she no longer whispered, to see if it would stay. Every few passes, she reached for the rope knot Samuel had tied and patted it, a private handshake with safety. At the fence line, Adrian worked in a rhythm old as fence lines. Measure, set, sight, tap, nail. The cedar pickets, once gray and doubtful, stood straighter for his attention. He wore a ball cap faded by 2 summers' forgiveness, a pencil behind one ear, and a little. The kind of smile men give when the day lets them be exactly what they came outside to be. On the porch, Samuel sat with a mug cooling in his hands and the paper folded to the back page. The headline someone else had wanted him to mind had turned itself into lining for tomorrow's fishing worms. He watched the world the way farmers do when the weather is finally a friend, not greedily, not nervously, but with gratitude that doesn't need performance. Margaret's pothos trailed green along the sill, generous as ever, and the blue and sage quilt, her stubborn, beautiful geometry, hung over the railing to take in the sun. He had mended a fraying edge this morning with the neat ladder of stitches he'd learned from Elena's lesson on a bear's torn ear. These days he found himself mending more and saying less. Under the maple lay Ranger, forelegs crossed in that dignified pose the old veterans take when they are both off-duty and never off-duty. The wind moved through his coat and turned up silver at the ruff, but the body underneath was still a good machine. His ears remained what they had always been, listening made visible. One turned toward the far road when a truck downshifted. The other remained tuned to the pendulum of a small girl's laughter. When a dragonfly strafed low, he blinked once and let it pass, as if angels might choose any shape they pleased. Emily's swing creaked a language the house had learned by heart. With every sweep she narrated something to the sky, a list of important facts delivered in breathless sentences. Ranger likes blueberries. Pancakes count as dinner if they have sky freckles. Nurse Elena can whistle with her fingers. The librarian knows your name the second time without looking. The swing listened as swings do, and the maple kept the secret shade of it all. A breeze came up out of the creek smelling of water and clay. It lifted the corner of a drawing taped low on the living room wall. The family under their tree, the dog with ears too big, a son with no mouth so it wouldn't talk over anyone. Paper cranes along the gallery strip shifted slightly as if conferring. The mason jar of daisies on the porch rail had traded yellow for seed. Still, the stems stood like small flags from last month's parade. When Adrian set a post just right, he stepped back and looked to the porch to find Samuel's eye. The old man gave a single slow nod, the master craftsman's benediction, and the hammer rose again. A robin scolded from the gatepost, and Adrian answered in the ridiculous whistle Samuel had taught him. A call and response that had confused every bird in the county without offending a one. Emily, flying by, declared them both bilingual and pumped her legs harder. The day's small noises stacked into something like a hymn, a saw's easy rasp, a lid settling on a pot inside. Dirt, whenever Emily dragged them to slow and changed directions. On the road, a neighbor waved from a pickup and tipped his chin to the porch. Samuel lifted his mug in return. The town had stopped gawking months ago. Belonging had become so ordinary it no longer needed witnesses. Which is how you know the work took. There had been other days. Not every morning came soft. Sometimes a pan fell in the kitchen, and Emily's shoulders jumped before her laugh remembered it already had permission. Sometimes the appeal threw its last handful of paper in the air, and Carla met the pages at the courthouse door with legal gravity and the kind of spine you cannot buy. Sometimes Adrian woke in the dark with his hand closed on absence, and lay still until Ranger's nose found him and moved that absence into the present's shape. They never pretended the road went straight, they only kept walking it together. Today the road was short and generous. Samuel sipped, let the coffee go cool enough to feel the sum of it slide down easy. He watched Adrian tap the last nail into the top rail and sight along the line. He watched Emily make a decision he could see from 30 feet away to jump at the height of the arc and land where the shadow of the branch cut a dark coin on the grass. She flew, small, knees bent, hair loose, a shout that belonged only to joy emptying from her like old rain from a bucket. She landed with 2 footfalls and 1 extra hop for style. Ranger's tail thumped once, the official record of safe landings amended. "Good flight," Samuel called. "Perfect landing," Adrian added. Emily spun, dizzy and pleased, and fell backward into the grass to let the sky put its cool hand on her face. The maple let light sift through its leaves and coins, and the coins moved across her, counting out what could not be counted. Days safe, words learned, nights slept through to morning. She held her necklace bead by bead and spelled it, not to prove anything, but because names taste good when spoken on a day like this. When she sat up, Ranger was already there, having covered the distance without looking like he had moved at all. He lowered his head until his amber eyes met hers. In those eyes the house saw again the barns dark and the hallways waiting, the courtroom's hard benches, the hospital's paper crane. It saw also the rope swing and the biscuits stolen politely from spatulas, the jar of marbles, the library cards signed in square, proud letters. Old things and new things rested together there without crowding, like photographs, finally arranged in unnecessary gesture, except for how necessary it felt. Adrian let him, which is its own kind of grace. "Fence'll hold," Samuel said. Adrian nodded. "So will she." Emily had returned to the swing and now drifted, heel dragging a furrow that would be gone with the next rain. She watched the two men through the seam of hair the wind pushed across her eyes. "Ready?" she asked them, meaning everything. "Always," Adrian said. "As long as there's coffee," Samuel added. Rangers settled again under the maple, forelegs crossed, eyes on the pendulum of her joy. A monarch butterfly collapsed and recovered above him. He watched it with the tolerance of elders for the young who haven't yet learned about wind. When the breeze shifted, he tasted it, filed it with all the other weathers in the long ledger he kept without paper. The sun made its slow decision toward evening. Somewhere down the road a screen door chimed. Somewhere up the hill a lawnmower gave up and called it a day. The house breathed in its windows and out its doors. The day's work stepped back and admired itself. Emily swung. Adrian straightened and wiped his palms on his jeans, satisfaction plain as the dust prints. Samuel stood with his hands on his hips and let himself be a man whose house belonged to people again. And under the tree, keeping the hours as if they were a post he had been assigned and had chosen, Ranger watched with those keen, forgiving eyes. If he slept with one ear awake. If he dreamed, it was of a barn finally empty of fear and a door that no longer slammed. If he prayed, well, dogs do that with their bodies. By staying, by listening, by knowing which way to face. It came to Samuel the way good sentences do, unadorned and true, and he said it without fanfare, as if placing a hand on a shoulder. "Sometimes angels don't wear wings," he murmured, watching the old shepherd lift his head to count the swing's return. "Sometimes they wear fur." In a world that often moves too fast, dogs, especially German shepherds, remind us to slow down and feel. Their loyalty isn't loud, but it's steady. It's in the quiet footsteps behind us, the eyes that watch over us without asking anything in return, and the way they just know when we need comfort most. Stories like these aren't just about dogs saving people, they're about how sometimes it's the animals who teach us how to love, trust, and heal. If this story touched your heart, maybe take a moment today to sit a little longer with your dog. Or if you're looking to strengthen that bond, there's a beautiful resource I found helpful. It offers gentle, meaningful ways to connect more deeply with the soul behind those eyes. I'll leave it here in case it speaks to you. Sometimes the best conversations need no words at all, and sometimes the most loyal hearts walk beside us on four legs.